Karina moved through the gym, each step measured, her grip tightening around the hilt of her katana. She hadn't slept much, but the restless night had done little to drain her energy. The moment she stepped onto the training mat, her focus sharpened, and all the swirling thoughts faded into the background. She started with slow, deliberate swings, feeling the weight of the blade in her hands, grounding herself in its familiar heft. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, she began a series of swift strikes, her blade cutting through the air with precision and purpose. She moved like a storm, every muscle in her body engaged, every strike a release of the tension coiled inside her. The more she pushed, the faster she moved, until she was a blur of motion. Her mind latched onto the rhythm of the workout, letting it drown out the questions and doubts that had plagued her through the night. With each swing, she imagined slicing through the shadows of her past, the trader's knowing gaze, Shade's whispered princess, all of it fading with each strike. As she spun into a particularly forceful swing, her katana crashed into a training dummy, sending it toppling to the ground. She barely registered the damage, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts as she reset the dummy, only to strike it again, harder. From the doorway, Darren leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. He watched her with a mix of awe and amusement, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he called out, his tone dripping with his usual sarcasm. "I'm pretty sure that dummy owes you money or something. Otherwise, that was just cruel." Karina paused, glancing over at him with narrowed eyes, but a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Need something, Darren?" she asked, her tone almost challenging. So Darren pushed himself off the wall and strolled over, pretending to inspect the demolished dummy. "Not really. Just came in for my usual morning workout, but, He gestured to the carnage. "Looks like I'd better steer clear of your warpath." She rolled her eyes, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I'm just clearing my head," she muttered, setting her stance again and giving the dummy another hard swing. Darren watched her, arms folded, as she unleashed a series of brutal strikes. "Yeah, I can see that. But you know, they make therapists for this sort of thing. Or meditation. Or, I don't know, punching bags." She shot him a look, and he raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying," he continued, grinning. "Whatever this dummy did to you, it's paying for it in full." Karina huffed, but there was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes now. "You're welcome to join me," she offered, twirling the katana with a challenging gleam. Darren held up a hand. "Oh, I think I'll pass. I enjoy my limbs attached, thanks." He eyed her katana with an exaggerated look of trepidation. "Besides, I don't have a death wish. That's your department, apparently." Karina chuckled despite herself, the tension in her shoulders easing a bit. Darren had a way of cutting through the heaviness, his light-hearted sarcasm a welcome relief from the intensity. She took a deep breath, letting the air settle in her lungs, and then set the katana aside, grabbing a towel to wipe her face. "Feeling better?" Darren asked, a genuine note of curiosity in his voice. "A little," she admitted, slinging the towel over her shoulder. "It's just... there's a lot on my mind. Shade, the trader. Everything feels tangled, and it's frustrating." Darren nodded, his smirk softening into something more sincere. "Yeah, I get that. But hey, whatever it is, you'll figure it out. You always do. Just maybe try not to take it out on the poor training dummies, all right? They've got families too, you know." She laughed, shaking her head. "Noted. I'll try to go easier on them next time." "Good," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "Because I don't think there are enough dummies in the world to survive another round with you." They walked out of the gym together, Karina feeling lighter for the first time since her sleepless night. Darren's humour had broken through the intensity, reminding her that, even amidst all the uncertainty, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. Karina made her way down the hallway, her footsteps measured and quiet. She knew Darren was following her. His footsteps, though softened, were impossible to miss. She rolled her eyes, smirking to herself. For all his talents, stealth was not one of Darren's strong suits. When she reached the garage, she turned to him, arms crossed. "You're not exactly a ghost, you know," she remarked. "If you're going to follow me, you might as well drive." Darren grinned, not the least bit embarrassed. "Gladly. Besides, I make a great chauffeur," he said, sliding into the driver's seat as she climbed in beside him. They drove in silence, the tension in the air thickening as they neared the bar. Karina's thoughts were on the trader and the questions she'd come to get answered. The Shadow Realm bar was a place of rules, a rare truce among its patrons, but tonight she felt the weight of her past bearing down on her with renewed intensity. When they arrived, they passed through the battered front doors into the dive bar. The dim lighting and worn-out furniture seemed to repel any notion of comfort. The front area was teeming with humans, all seemingly oblivious to the deeper, darker secrets hidden beyond the back door. Karina walked through without sparing a glance at the mundane crowd, moving purposefully toward the door at the back. Darren followed her, taking in the dingy surroundings with a grimace. "Lovely place you've chosen for a night out," he muttered, earning a brief, amused glance from her. At the back door, they approached a towering, beastly bouncer who stood guard. Karina knew the drill. She handed over her katana without hesitation this time, the blade gleaming under the dim light. The bouncer's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by her quick compliance, before narrowing as he met her gaze. "Truce," he said, his deep voice reverberating in the small space, a reminder of the unbreakable rules within the Shadow Realm bar. Karina gave a curt nod, acknowledging the terms. The truce kept order, preventing any violence or supernatural powers from being used within the realm, no matter how high tensions ran. With a steadying breath, she stepped through the door, the familiar shimmer of magic washing over her as she crossed into the Shadow Realm. Cut to Darren. Outside, Darren watched her disappear through the door. He glanced around, noticing the curious glances from the patrons at the bar, then decided to follow her in. But as he reached for the door handle, he found himself back outside, in the alley behind the bar. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Figures," he muttered. He tried the door again, only to find himself in the same spot. Before he could turn around, two figures approached from the shadows, human in appearance but exuding an eerie, unsettling presence. They were hunched together, clutching something between them, a small vial that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. One of them glanced up, eyes narrowing as he took in Darren's presence. "What's an Earthborn doing back here?" he sneered. Darren raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Sightseeing. You know, the alley tour. Heard it's the best in town." The other man, stocky and brimming with tension, scowled. "Think you're funny?" "Oh, I'm hilarious," Darren replied, smirking. "You should stick around for the whole set." The first man moved suddenly, throwing a punch that caught Darren on the jaw. He staggered back, but before he could react, a massive figure appeared beside him, casting a shadow over the alley. The newcomer, standing over 6 feet tall and built like a tank, grabbed the man by the collar, lifting him off the ground with ease. "We're outside the truce," the thug protested, his voice tinged with fear. "Doesn't apply here." The giant raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening. "Wrong," he growled, and with a flick of his wrist, he hurled the man over a stone fence, sending him crashing out of sight. The remaining thug dropped his vial, glancing nervously between Darren and the giant before bolting back down the alley. Darren brushed himself off, rubbing his sore jaw and giving the massive stranger a lopsided grin. "Thanks for the save, big guy. You always this friendly?" The giant merely shook his head, saying nothing as he turned and vanished back into the shadows. Darren bent down, picking up the vial, and inspected it before slipping it into his pocket. "Well, this has been enlightening," he muttered, making his way back inside. When he entered the bar, he took a seat at the counter, ordering a drink and settling in to wait for Karina. Darren leaned back on his stool at the bar, his gaze flickering around the room as he sipped his drink. The place looked like any rundown dive bar from the outside, but inside it was something else entirely. The humans, or those who appeared human, sat in quiet clusters, their eyes darting to the shadows as if something unseen might emerge at any moment. There was a strange energy in the air, an undercurrent of tension that seemed to ripple through the patrons. He noticed one man sitting a few stools away, nursing a glass of something thick and dark that didn't look like any liquor Darren had ever seen. His eyes glinted an unnatural shade of yellow under the dim lights, and his fingers tapped rhythmically on the bar, almost like a signal. Across the room, a woman with silver hair and an ageless face spoke to a man with a hawkish expression. Their conversation was hushed, but their gestures sharp and furtive. Every now and then her fingers seemed to shimmer, her nails elongating briefly before retracting. A low hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional sound of glass clinking. Darren could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, and he had the distinct impression that everyone here was more than they seemed. He took another sip, pretending not to notice the way the bartender, a thin man with an elongated face and a permanent scowl, kept glancing his way, as though trying to figure out what he was doing there. Karina's perspective in the shadow realm. Karina stepped through the doorway and into the shadow realm, feeling the familiar rush of magic wash over her as she crossed the threshold. The bar looked different here, darker, quieter, with an air of mystery that seemed to hang heavy in the shadows. The patrons here were no longer hiding their true forms. She spotted creatures with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like embers, their attention turning toward her as she moved through the room. Karina had found her mark. She approached the trader, her movements controlled but simmering with intent. The trader, a wiry man with a thin mustache and a gaze that seemed to pierce through her, watched her approach with a faint, knowing smile. "What's your name?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. The trader tilted his head, his eyes flicking over her with an air of mild amusement. "Names are but shadows, fleeting and elusive," he replied, his voice smooth and maddeningly calm. Karina's jaw clenched. "I don't have time for riddles. I need answers." The trader spread his hands in a gesture of feigned innocence. "Ah, but answers are like grains of sand, slipping through the fingers." Her patience snapped, and she took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not asking again." The murmur of conversations around them faded as heads began to turn, eyes watching the unfolding confrontation. The trader seemed to sense the growing attention, and his tone shifted as though to placate her. "Very well," he said, leaning in. "For now, you may call me Tarsin." "Tarsin," she repeated, skepticism lacing her words. "Is that even your real name?" He merely smiled, his expression inscrutable. "Names are only real if you believe in them." The crowd around them grew quieter, the silence thickening as Karina's frustration mounted. She glanced around, realizing she was drawing attention, and tried to pull back. But Tarsin continued, his words twisting around the truth, leading her nowhere. "I've had enough," she muttered, reaching out and gripping the front of his shirt. She pulled him closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're going to start giving me real answers, or—" "Truce," rumbled a deep voice beside her. The single word cut through the tension like a blade, its weight almost physical. Karina turned to see the massive bouncer standing over her, his face contorted as though speaking had caused him great pain. She released Tarsin, taking a step back, her eyes never leaving the trader's face. The distraction had given him just enough room to slip out of her grasp. In a heartbeat, he was gone, melting into the shadows of the bar. Karina cursed under her breath, scanning the room for any sign of him, but he had disappeared as though he'd never been there. She turned to the bouncer, frustration flaring in her eyes. But before she could speak, another voice called out, "Princess Calithra, is it really you?" She spun around, her heart racing, and found herself face to face with Shade. His expression was one of disbelief, tinged with something else, fear, or perhaps regret. He reached out, pressing a small rolled-up parchment into her hand. Take this, he whispered. It may not be the answers you want, but it's a start. Before she could respond, Shade slipped back into the crowd, leaving her alone with the parchment in her hand. She barely had time to process what had happened before a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. Must go, the bouncer rumbled, his voice strained as though speaking was a painful effort. His fingers were like iron, guiding her toward the door with a finality that brooked no argument. Karina resisted for a moment, but there was no point. The rules of the truce were clear, and she had already pushed the boundaries. She shot one last glance around the bar, her gaze lingering on the faces of the patrons who had watched the exchange. But they quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. As she stepped through the doorway and back into the mundane world, she felt the weight of Shade's message in her hand and the familiar coil of frustration in her chest. The night had given her more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. The shadows of her past were closing in, and she was no longer sure she could escape them. The cold night air wrapped around Karina as she stepped out of the bar, her face an unreadable mask. She caught Darren's eye as he leaned against the car, raising an eyebrow at her with a lopsided grin. Wordlessly, she nodded, and he fell in beside her. They slid into the car, the silence stretching between them as the engine rumbled to life. He glanced over as she held up a small, rolled parchment, her fingers tracing the edges as though it held all the answers and none at once. She stared at it, eyes narrowed in contemplation, before dropping it into her lap with a sigh. "So," Darren began, leaning back as he watched her with a curious tilt of his head, "you find out if he's a long-lost cousin or just a guy with bad fashion sense?" Karina shot him a sidelong glance, managing a faint smirk. "Something like that. He gave me his name, Tarsin, apparently, and then Shade showed up." She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the parchment as she continued. "Called me princess like he knew who I was. Before I could even blink, he handed me this." Darren's eyes flicked to the parchment in her lap, his usual smirk softening. "Sounds like quite the night out. So what's the hold-up? Don't you want to see what it says?" Karina frowned, her grip tightening on the rolled paper. "I'm not sure. Part of me feels like, once I read this, there's no going back. It's not just about me anymore." Darren chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Karina. You've been carrying the weight of whatever this is long before tonight. This little scroll's just another piece of the puzzle." She looked away, chewing on her lip as she considered his words. I don't know if I'm ready. What if it's something I can't handle?" Darren's expression softened, his usual sarcasm replaced by a rare hint of seriousness. "Look, you've handled worse things than a piece of paper. You've been dealing with the unknown all your life, haven't you?" He paused, the grin returning as he nudged her shoulder. "Besides, you're not exactly the type to shy away from a fight, so why start now?" Karina exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the parchment. She could feel its weight, as though the words within held something much larger than herself. "I guess I'm just worried that whatever's in here will change everything." Darren shrugged, giving her a reassuring smile. "Maybe it will, but maybe that's what you need. Sometimes the things we're afraid of are just the beginning of something we didn't know we were waiting for." He reached over, patting her hand. "You've got this, princess." She rolled her eyes, but the tension in her shoulders eased a little. All right. Maybe I'll open it. But if it says I'm secretly the queen of the universe or something, I'm going to blame you for jinxing it." Darren grinned, leaning back as he settled into his seat. "Hey, I'm just here for the ride. But if you do end up queen of the universe, I expect at least a castle." They shared a rare laugh, the tension between them breaking as the parchment sat patiently in her lap, waiting for her to decide. Karina took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of the paper as she made her choice. The night stretched ahead, and whatever lay within those words would be the first step on a path she couldn't yet see. But at least she realized she wasn't walking it alone. The drive back to the workshop was quiet, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on them. Karina kept her gaze fixed out the window, clutching the parchment as though it might disappear if she let go. Beside her, Darren drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. When they pulled up to the workshop, Darren glanced over at her. "You know," he started, fishing in his pocket, "I actually found something myself tonight." He held up a small glass vial, its contents glimmering faintly even in the low light. Karina raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "No clue," Darren replied, handing it over. "Picked it up after a little, disagreement outside the bar. I'd bet it's something shady. One of those guys back there dropped it like it was contraband." She turned the vial over in her hand, noting the iridescent liquid inside. It seemed to swirl of its own accord, almost as if it were alive. "This doesn't look like any potion I've seen before," she murmured, frowning. "Yeah, figured it was worth showing Gunnar," Darren said, stepping out of the car and motioning for her to follow. "If there's something weird going on at that bar, he'll want to know." They entered the workshop, the quiet hum of machinery and the familiar scent of oil and metal welcoming them back. They found Gunnar in his office, poring over a set of blueprints, his intense gaze shifting when they walked in. He looked up, his expression softening slightly as he took in the sight of them. "You're back," he remarked, folding the blueprints and setting them aside. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Karina exchanged a quick glance with Darren before handing over the vial. "Not exactly. We've got more questions than answers." She took a breath, her grip tightening on the vial before she released it into Gunnar's hand. "We found this." Darren picked it up outside. It was in the middle of some kind of shady transaction. Gunnar examined the vial, holding it up to the light. The liquid inside shimmered, its colour shifting from a deep violet to an almost green hue. "This isn't just any ordinary substance," he muttered. "This looks like something out of the shadow realm. Could be magical, or at the very least, supernatural." Karina nodded, feeling the weight of the parchment still in her other hand. "And then there's this," she added, holding it up but not quite ready to unroll it. "Shade gave it to me. It might have answers about my past, but I haven't read it yet." Gunnar met her gaze, his eyes steady and reassuring. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. If there's something in there that can help us understand what's going on, it's worth knowing, but only when you're ready." Darren, leaning casually against the doorframe, nodded. "Hey, maybe the vial and that parchment are connected. Could be we're dealing with something bigger than just Nethoria's secrets." Karina took a steadying breath, feeling the truth of his words. There were pieces here, scattered fragments of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. But with Gunnar and Darren by her side, she felt a little less alone in the maze of her own past. "All right," she said, determination settling into her bones. "Let's figure this out. Whatever's coming, I want to be ready."
All right, you've made it this far. That means either you like what you're seeing, or you're lost. Either way, no harm in sticking around, right? Go on, hit that subscribe button, join the team, and while you're at it, hit like, because, let's be honest, you're already invested. And the bell? That's for you if you don't want to miss any of the action. You wouldn't want me to come find you. See you soon, and remember, once you're in, you're family.